course, and the academia in 2023 is in many ways a dream come true for many of us here in the audience. And of course, it's very, very timely given what we have seen here in Israel and many countries around the world in the last decade. So we have an amazing group of panelists today that needs no introduction, but I will introduce them very briefly. I'll start with Dr. Cristina Caffarra, that is a leading competition expert to set up the European practice of Keystone. And prior to joining Keystone, she was for 15 years the head of European competition at Charles River Associates. She has directed economic analysis in multiple competition investigations in some of the landmark mergers and antitrust matters of the past 25 years. We may use Cristina today to build on what Luigi said as a whistleblower, because she's been inside those giant corporations for many years. So Cristina, please join us. Ariel Ezrachi is the Slaughter and May Professor of Competition Law and Fellow at Pembroke College, Oxford. He serves as the Director of the University of Oxford Center of Competition Law and Policy. He's the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Antitrust Enforcement and the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of numerous books. I thought, I'm going to mention a couple of books, and then I realized the list is endless. Thank you, Ariel. Please join us. William Bill Kovacic is a global competition professor of law and policy, professor of law, director, Competition Law Center in George Washington University. Before joining the law school in 1999, Kovacic was the George Mason University Foundation professor at the George Mason University School of Law. From 2006 to October 2011, he was the member of the Federal Trade Commission and chaired the agency from March 2008 to March 2009. He was the FTC's general counsel from June 2001 to December 2004. In 2011, he received the FTC Miles W. Kirkpatrick Award of Lifetime Achievement, and since August 2013, Professor Kovacic has served as a non-executive director with the United Kingdom's Competition and Market Authority. Please, Bill. Where is Jesse? Oh, here's Jesse. So Jesse Fried is a professor of law at the Harvard Law School. Before joining the Harvard faculty in 2009, Jesse was a professor of law and faculty co-director of the Berkeley Center of Law, Business, and the Economy at the University of California, Berkeley. His well-known book, Pay Without Performance, The Unfulfilled Promise of Executive Competition, co-authored with Lucian Bebchuk, has been widely acclaimed by both academics and practitioners and translated into Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and Italian. So what about the Hebrew edition, Jesse? Okay, here we don't have that problem, of course. Fried has served as a consultant and expert witness in litigation involving executive compensation and corporate governance issue. He also serves on the Research Advisory Council of proxy advisor Glass Lewis & Co. Please join us. We have Matt Stoller is not here, so I asked two of my best friends to join us here today for this discussion. Luigi, please join us. Ido already introduced Luigi, and Professor Roy Shapira. By the way, Roy has been a fantastic friend for many years, but he never told me that he got his professorship. This is the kind of guy he is. Luigi, please join us. Okay, yeah. Roy Shapira, among many other things, he's a professor at law at Reichman University, and he's very interested in a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss today, including business and corporate reputation, which has a lot to do with media, of course, and antitrust. And of course, Roy was a fellow for many years at the Stigler Center in the first couple of years when Luigi took over the center, and we started looking closely at the role of concentration in the antitrust. Okay. So, as you know, when we started planning this conference almost a year ago, we didn't know that we were going to have an attempted coup d'etat in Israel. We knew Israeli democracy is fragile, but many of us were shocked in January 4th when Minister Yariv Levin laid out his plans for restructuring our democratic institution. And I believe that at this point, most of us who care about democracy do not take it for granted anymore. And we spend much more time in thinking about what is needed to preserve and strengthen it, and we should. What hasn't changed since we started planning this conference, and in many ways probably got much worse, is the problem of cost of living in Israel, and especially the discussion on the role of monopolies, cartels in creating it. Absent from this conference today, as you notice, is the chairwoman of the Antitrust Authority, the Israeli one, that last week we learned that the government is trying to fire as a scapegoat, my opinion, for their own incompetence. But although we can and should suspect Netanyahu and his economic minister Nir Barkat real motives to fire the chairperson of the Antitrust Authority, it still does not absolve our antitrust agencies, academic researchers and experts from blame for the lack of any meaningful antitrust enforcement in Israel in the last decade or maybe even longer. Israeli, to quote one of the former head of antitrust in Israel, Dror Strum, Israel is leading the world in number of monopolies, cartels, and exclusionary conducts. And many times it seems that its antitrust ideas and practices are captured by a handful of law firms and paid consultants working for big money. So we want to talk today about at least three issues. First, understand what's happening in the US and perhaps Europe in the last 5 years. Is there another antitrust revolution in the making with the appointments of people like Jonathan Kanter, Lina Khan, and Tim Wu? Secondly, we want to understand what is the connection between democracy and antitrust. Are antitrust laws relevant to preserving democracy and how that discussion changed in the last 130 years? And thirdly, we want to understand what went wrong in antitrust enforcement in the US and perhaps Israel that imported some of that US ideology in the last decades, and should we go about changing that? All right, so I will start with you, Bill, for two reasons. You are an historian of antitrust and not only a practitioner, and I think you wrote a couple of years ago an important essay on the revolution that is happening in your eyes in the antitrust in the US. So give us, like in 7 minutes, your 130 years of history of thoughts about antitrust. No, I mean really what's happening recently in antitrust. Go ahead.
First, thanks so much to the organizers, to Ido, to Guy for the marvelous opportunity to participate in the discussion, and to our host here at the university. I think a foundation for significant policy change is a reservoir of ideas. The system of competition law from its beginning in the US has depended upon an intellectual infrastructure that supports the development of policy. And a good deal of the modern story at the United States has been the shift in the debate. And to emphasize that the shift in the debate is an enormously powerful change and may be one of the most durable contributions of what are often called the neo-Brandeisians, the advocates of a fundamental transformation. What do they do? First, they worked prodigiously over the past 20 years or so to create a new literature. It was a new literature that was founded in many ways by journalists who had a fascination with the details of individual industries and wrote powerful case studies that focused on the fragility of the US economy in many respects. They were joined by more traditionally trained academics who shared their values, and working prodigiously hard turned out an absolute avalanche of documentation and of policy prescriptions. In many ways, they did exactly what the Chicago School did in the 60s and 70s. They saw an intellectual orthodoxy, which they thought to be questionable. They saw its vulnerabilities and frailties, and they bore down on them with the same ferocity, determination of effort. And in doing that, I mean, aided by the Stigler Center, which gave them an extremely important platform in the US, aided by the development of new media, strikingly, what they did to ascend is to just bypass the traditional structures of the profession, the bar, and many of the media outlets, except they cultivated relationships with specific columnists. Someone like Rania Faruhar at the Financial Times, they cultivated relationships that were very important to planning their ideas, but they basically looked at the entrenched institutions that defended the status quo, did not decide to assault them head on. That's a risky, dangerous, and bloody fight. They just circumvented them. They bypassed them and stranded them in a way that was so quick and so powerful, I don't think that the traditionalists really know what hit them. They're still trying to get the license number of the truck that drove over them. It happened dramatically and quickly. And with the new literature, what they've done is set in place, especially with a younger generation of scholars who overwhelmingly focus on this point of view, is set in motion an intellectual change that's going to endure for decades, so that the center of gravity will be their ideas. And in many ways, they push the orthodoxy in many respects on the back foot. All of a sudden, the orthodoxy looks old, it looks tired, it looks stale. And it's going to be challenged and contested by a new generation of scholars that have set in motion a fundamental change. To my mind, if that's all they had done, that's a big deal. Fantastic. Because that's durable. Fantastic. But they did more. And the closing thought is they got power. They got power in a way that they never imagined, except they cultivated the political relationships with people like Elizabeth Warren, and planted in her mind the idea that, by the way, if you ever get power, don't forget us. She didn't. And her political bargain with Joe Biden was, I'll support you, I'll get out of the way, I'll help clear the path to the White House, but you owe me something. You owe me gatekeeping power on appointees to the regulatory agencies. And Joe Biden said, deal. And he has stuck with it. And as a result, when it came to picking the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, the head of the Antitrust Division, other regulators, it goes through Elizabeth Warren. I have a friend who raised money for Joe Biden, a Democrat her whole life, was a key bundler in Manhattan. She said, I thought I was raising money to put Joe Biden in the White House. I didn't realize I was electing Elizabeth Warren instead. And it accurately reflects the power she's had. The real question is, will they be able to take the aspirations and ideas that galvanize the development of a new body of thinking and convert it into policy that endures? That's the hard part. That's a work in progress. Now, to do that, you got to win a bunch of elections, pick a bunch of judges. You need staying power. And that's the big question right now. But if you'd asked, if you'd given Barry Lynn and his colleagues truth serum, Lena Khan as a young academic 5 years ago, in 2021, are you going to have your people in charge of the two leading antitrust agencies in the United States? Truth serum, mind you, they're going to have to answer truthfully. I think Barry, Lena, and the others, Matt, who's not here, would have said not a chance. In fact, it came so quick in such a remarkably unexpected fashion, they weren't ready for it. And in some respects, they lost a lot of time getting their program underway. So what's the grade now on actual implementation? It's a work in progress, incomplete, as we say in the academic world. But nobody thought they'd get this far, and the change in ideas is going to endure.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. So, Cristina, in order for that revolution to be so successful, as Bill said, in some respects, something wrong has to go on for a lot of time. And you have become more and more vocal gradually in the last decade or so about antitrust enforcement. So, Cristina, what went wrong? Who captured antitrust?
First, let me echo Bill in thanking you and Ido and the organizer of this remarkable event. I'm delighted to be here. I'm not sure that I can define myself as a whistleblower, but certainly someone who from within the tent has been saying for a very long time the king is naked. And the reason it is naked is that my observation as a practitioner, as someone who has been working on cases at the cold face and knowing where all the bodies are buried, is that over time, this Chicago orthodoxy, which has been the institutional foundation for what we've done in the last 40 years, has revealed its massive problems. And this became increasingly obvious. It is an intellectual foundation which essentially has begotten the consumer welfare, is founded on the notion of consumer welfare, which was presented at the time as an intellectual development in the direction of truth. We embraced this Chicago Revolution as practitioners as a definite improvement. We were moving forward. We had methods. We had science. Antitrust was no longer a soft kind of practice. We could actually apply as economists our tools to actually achieve scientific certainty. Now, that inevitably, or perhaps not inevitably, but in practice meant that the profession became very influential. Economists became very influential. They were relied upon by the defense bar in particular to support defense narratives. There's an expression that says there is an app for that. You cannot name a single conduct, exclusives, time, bundling, that economists have not been able to actually find exculpatory narratives for. This is what we've done for the last 20, 30 years. We have supported defense coming up with plausible narratives for why all of this was actually ultimately pro-competitive. There is no merger I've been involved in the last 25 years, and I've done more than 200, in which the frontline story wasn't, this is a pro-competitive deal. Reality, no, they are not pro-competitive. You are in the room with the board members, and they say, well, when we buy you, we will raise prices, okay? We'll scrub all of this from the documents. The reality is that mergers are intended, in the main, to increase power, to exercise that power. And frankly, it is the way things are set up. So we economists have been aiding and abetting this kind of process by essentially producing narratives that effectively have supported it. Now, I think, going back to Bill's point, what we're witnessing now is a major inflection that actually started in the US. And let me say briefly something as a European. I come to it, of course, as somebody who practiced all her life in Europe. So the consumer welfare orthodoxy in Europe was slightly less extreme than it has been in the US as a dominant intellectual orthodoxy, but still we embraced it. And in Europe, we did sort of proceed along those lines, although Europe, coming from an ordoliberal tradition, had somewhat of a different path. But the reality is that it has become clear that that kind of the values that have animated antitrust in the last 20, 30 years are not delivering. And we have plenty of empirical evidence as economists, and we see it in published studies, that the economy doesn't perform well. Margins are going up. Concentration is going up in parallel. So the outcomes are not favoring consumers. And this is the premise from which the Brandeisian Barry Lynn, Matt, if he was here, would proceed. We are observing that the economy is not doing well for the people. So never mind great companies having mergers. Judge Sorokin blocking the American Airlines JetBlue combination just a couple of weeks ago said the purpose of antitrust is not to allow big companies to become big and fight big companies. It is not that. It is to preserve competition. Amen. But the reality is that the Brandeisians have actually come and challenged that orthodoxy, which had become pervasive. And I remember hearing for the first time Barry and Matt Stoller and Lena talking about the animating values of antitrust as being different, needing to be different. It needs to be freedom from all masters. It needs to be the dispersion of economic power in some sense, not aiding and abetting the creation of further power. So bottom line is that this inflection is, as Bill has described masterfully as always, underway in the US. It's a great experiment. In Europe, we are sort of watching this like, whoa, what's going on? Ooh. We started off being, in Europe, fairly at the forefront of competition enforcement, for reasons we can go into later. We are no longer the first boys and girls in the class. Now we've been overtaken by the Americans, and we're going, what's going on over there? We kind of don't get it. But hey, it's exciting. So I'll stop here, but there is no question that what has gone wrong is that we have embraced this kind of view of the world. There has been a ton of money made by economists and consultants in the process defending these exculpatory narratives, which is why we are where we are. And we certainly haven't helped anything at all.
Thank you, Cristina. You are a whistleblower, you are. You don't want to admit it. But I need, yeah, so Luigi, I need to bring you in the fold because when Cristina says economists aiding and abetting, Bill said that the Stigler Center had an important role in starting this conversation about what's really happening in antitrust in the U.S. Do you think it's going back to Clemenceau, your quote that you are a finance professor and not an IO economist?
No, that's for sure. First of all, it's easier to see a problem when you're not inside a tent. There's no doubt that it was much easier for me to be critical because I'm not an IO economist. And actually, one thing I want to point out is, our friend Fiona, she's an IO economist. When she writes about finance, she's super aggressive. And she has this paper with Eric Posner that on the presumption that there might be a possibility of common ownership, she want to break up every index funds on the face of Earth with putting like a very small, etc., very prescriptive with very little evidence. You don't see any of that in IO writing. And the question is why? I think is in part is because she's also a consultant, not in the finance, but in IO. And so you need to have a different standard. So I think that the extent to which the expert witness profession has shaped the view of the academics, I think is way underestimated in the academic debate. I think this is something that we need to look ourselves more closely and analyze. And I think is, yeah.
Okay, Luigi, I'll come back to you later when we talk about democracy now. Professor Ezrachi, Ariel. So you've been very active in the last decade at the forefront here, actually, when you talk about digital monopolies. But before we go into digital monopolies, and by the way, although you're from Oxford, many people here says I'm a foreigner. I don't know what's happening in Israel. You cannot absolve yourself from that. We know where you come from. So I want to start the discussion on democracy with you. So tell us about this relationship between antitrust and democracy.
Yes, thank you. And again, a real pleasure to be here. So it's a big story, but let's just highlight a few things that I think could be interesting. We all understand the issue of power and democracy, and then if we go one link backwards, we understand how competition law can help us have more competitive markets. This is important at two levels. One would be power, because powerful companies impact on democratic process. The other one would be, as Luigi indicated, the market for ideas, just our ability to have a discussion. So that is our starting point. What can competition law do in practice? This is where it becomes really interesting for us. How can you utilize this instrument? And here we touch upon some elements that Cristina mentioned, but also others, where it all depends on how you view the role of competition. If competition law is viewed from European perspective, then competition was always an instrument to advance what is now the Union, and therefore it's instrumental in creating several freedoms and also ensuring liberal markets, ensuring markets where you have certain freedoms, and therefore you can take competition law, and when you have a case, you can say this is not only about efficiency. This is also about other values. And here in Europe, at least you have the potential. It's a different question whether you're going to go ahead with that. But competition law is like a sponge. It's just a discipline. It doesn't matter where you put it. It will absorb whatever you want. Going to the US, it was captured by technocrats. It was completely limited and brought very close to irrelevance in the context of what we're discussing. And what happens then is that the idea that you have a certain purity of analysis, which is very economic, and that means it's neutral, is very misleading, because even that idea in itself is political. So no matter how you look at it, if you want competition law to be applied to become an instrument that will enable us to ensure that we have competition in media, competition between corporations, limit certain aspects, but also penalize actions that limit our freedom, it's a political decision that impacts on the scope of competition. When you see now the movement in the US, what you also see is the pushback from the courts. Every attempt to change the narrative is being pushed back. And here I want to link it to another thing, how competition law has been polluted for many years. The discussion of competition law, we present it as if it's semi-economic, semi-pure, but you have businesses that invest a lot of money, A, in capturing the debate, B, in the US we have, for example, training the judges in certain aspects. So against the attempt to make markets more competitive, you have not only those in power who are not always keen on democracy, but you also have businesses that through the back door, either through lobbying or through their ability to impact on how we think because of commissioned articles, because of the way they train, have completely captured the debate. So the overall system that we have is that we understanding the link between competition and democracy is the easiest thing. What can we do about it is much more problematic. Not because the discipline cannot be used to do that, but because the discipline has evolved in different jurisdictions differently, and jurisdictions are linked, and the ethos that we have behind competition law has a certain facade of almost mathematical certainty, and that does not help those who try to widen the scope of competition, because it will always put the brakes on any attempt that we will have to actually make use of it. And last comment, I know we have a lot to cover. When you try to limit one thing, and in our case it's competition law, and limit its effectiveness, it is not effective even in the EU, and Cristina noted that. We're doing a lot of good, but it's nothing in comparison to the rest. The pressure has to be released somewhere. And this is why you have this wave of regulatory interventions. So in the US, you have a pipeline packed with regulations that will likely not reach the final destination, because they will somehow be delayed or blocked completely. In the EU, we have the DMA, the DSA. So it's a false victory. Those who thought that they are winning by taking a flexible and balanced instrument like competition law that has limiting principles and has a logic where you always try to identify the right level of intervention, those who try to completely suppress it will later on have to deal with regulation that might be draconian and might actually benefit us in one way, but might also harm us in another. So it's a rather complex matrix in which we operate.
Yeah, perhaps we'll have time later to go back to the question of regulation versus antitrust. Jesse, you are also not an antitrust academic here, but you are in corporate governance and finance, and you know a lot about power in corporation. And one of the question here is that, should antitrust deal and focus solely on consumer welfare, or maybe perhaps on the questions of accumulation of power per se, and because maybe it's also important not only to the competitive process but also to our democratic institutions.
Well, thanks for inviting me to be on this panel, Ido and Guy. Let me start with a caveat. I'm on a panel with very distinguished antitrust academics and practitioners. I'm a mere corporate governance person. I am ignorant of antitrust. But I have never let my I have never let my own ignorance stop me from talking. And so I'm not going to start here. So I'm going to offer some thoughts. I hope to be provocative. And I hope that I get Guy Rolnik a little bit excited by what I'm about to say. So my understanding of neo-Brandeisian antitrust is that the objective should not just be to increase consumer welfare, but to break up businesses as a power center so that they don't have a pernicious influence on politics. Now, this view makes sense in a world where politics would yield the outcome that you want in the absence of business pressure. So if you are a liberal Democrat, and I assume most of the people in the room are, you would believe that if business was put aside, the democratic process would yield a government that was tolerant, inclusive, technocratically savvy, would deliver a great society for the population. And if that's your view, then limiting the power of business to interfere makes sense. But what if we live in the real world where what we have now are right-wing populist governments coming to power, and these right-wing populist governments want to put in place policies that may be very appealing to their own supporters, but probably not appealing to many of the people in this room. Homophobic policies, xenophobic policies, entrenchment of the ruling coalition. In that case, maybe having businesses be involved in politics would be a good thing. Why? It's true that the people running business are selfish and greedy and want to make money for themselves. On the other hand, they tend to be pretty smart and probably smarter than the typical politician that gets elected. They tend to understand how institutions work in society, unlike many of the politicians. They also have a stake in society working reasonably well in order to make profits. So in that case, if you think that you're going to have right-wing populist governments come to power, having businesses influence political outcomes might be a good thing. What am I thinking of in particular? I'm thinking of Israel. So we just had, and I'm using the word we because I'm Jewish, I care about the country here. We just had a government come into power, propose a series of legal reforms that, in my humble opinion, would have had adverse effects on human rights, would have led to entrenchment of the current ruling coalition over time, would have increased corruption, would have harmed the economy. The first people to protest about this were academics in Israel, but of course they're all left-wingers, so why pay attention to them? They have absolutely no credibility. In fact, the more the academics here protest, the more powerful is the government's position. Then you had lawyers protest, but of course they have a vested interest in pleasing the people on the Supreme Court, so we can't pay attention to them. Nobody started paying attention until people in business said, this is going to be bad. And it started with the high-tech people, but then it eventually escalated. And the last intervention, as far as I know, was the four big banks, their CEOs got together and said, this is going to be really bad. And eventually the Histadrut figured this out, and of course it helped that the military, people in the reserves were protesting, which was very frightening to people. But in the end, the reform, in my view, is dead, in part, I think, because of business intervention. If business had been quiet, the outcome might have been different and might have been worse. Okay? So here we have an example, I think, where business getting involved in politics led to an outcome that, at least for me, seemed better. Now let's go back to Brandeisian antitrust. So let's suppose that we're successful in crushing business as a power center in society. Is that going to lead to a better outcome when you have a lot of right-wing populism? I don't think so. Because you're going to reduce the power of basically a sane group of people, true greedy, but also sane, and that's going to allow other people to be more powerful. And the more powerful you make antitrust as a mechanism for crushing business, the more power you give right-wing populist governments to suppress opposition. I don't think it's a coincidence that Smotrich recently came out and said that the banks should be taxed on their excess profits because interest rates are rising. You know, it was the banks that came out against him and his government. And, you know, he probably had other reasons for it, but there is some potential risk in a world of right-wing populism of giving too much power to the antitrust authorities in government.
All right. Thank you very much, Jesse. So there is the question of competition, and there is also the notion, if we're talking about Louis Brandeis, of bigness per se. And Roy, you write a lot about corporate reputation, and you have another angle on the dangers of bigness per se that goes farther than usually what antitrust examines and takes into consideration, please.
Right, so thanks for having me. And like Jesse, I'm not an antitrust expert. I'm also a mere corporate governance, but even less of a corporate governance expert. But I do study corporate misbehavior, and I think that these two fields of corporate misbehavior and antitrust have grown closer together over the last few years, going back to what Bill and Cristina said about the changing narrative. Now the rallying cry for many anti-monopolists is big is bad because it is ungovernable. I mean, it used to be that the rallying cry in antitrust circles was big is bad because it lowers outputs and increases prices, right? The classic harms to consumer narrative. But now the point is that big is bad because it harms like other things, not just the democratic process, as Jesse was talking about, but there's a set of corporate misbehavior that it would like to deter, like environmental pollution, for example, consumer fraud. And there are certain social institutions meant to deter such corporate misbehavior, so not just litigation and regulation, but also what Luigi discussed, media scrutiny, reputation, even moral constraints. I wouldn't be able to sleep for myself at night, and so on and so forth. And the question is whether there is something about size, once a firm crosses a certain threshold, accumulates market power, that renders all these institutions somewhat less effective. So that's probably the claim right now, one of the central claims. So say that we're talking about user privacy, okay? The regulator notices that a certain giant platform violates user privacy, goes to these giant platform, tell them, don't do it anymore. Okay, we won't do it. I just caught you doing it again. I'm going to impose a $10 million sanction on you. Okay, we won't do it again. I just caught you doing it again. I'm going to impose a $5 billion sanction, and so on and so forth. And so for us as academics, the question is, A, is it true? Is it more than just anecdotes? And B, what to do about it? And so on the is it true front, Luigi used many great examples in his keynote. I want to use another Luigi-related example, which is the DuPont example. Okay, so DuPont, one of the largest chemical companies in the world, great company, produces many fantastic products, very reputation sensitive, very green, gets all the CSR accolades. And they were the ones producing Teflon, but also in the process of producing Teflon, they emitted to the air for more than 6 decades an extremely toxic chemical called PFOA. Right, so they knew inside the company very early on that it's very toxic, that it's biopersistent, bioaccumulative, never breaks in the environment, and they still did it. So how can such a bad thing happen to such a good company? So when Luigi and I studied it, we said that it's because pollution pays. You know, if you're a long-term shareholder of DuPont, it paid to pollute. But the relevance to this panel today is that when we first started presenting it, Luigi, I don't know if you would remember it, we used to say we chose this case study because it's a least likely case, meaning that if it could happen to DuPont, it could happen everywhere. This is not just by a fly-by-night operator. This is a great company, sensitive to reputation, and so on and so forth. But when you think about it, it's probably the flip side, meaning it could only happen in DuPont. If it would be a small chemical company, they would probably still use this profitable chemical. They would still pollute, but somebody will catch them, and then when they'll catch them, they'll go out of business, and maybe the executives will go to jail. Okay, with DuPont, they had, again, just going back to Luigi's talk, the only game in town, so no journalist wanted to get out with this story. Nobody wanted to blow the whistle because you can't switch, you don't have an alternative place to work at. Once the issue did get some press, they hired 2 top EPA officials to handle the PR for them through the revolving door. Luigi just mentioned now the expert witnesses, all the great chemical academics on retainer and so on and so forth. And so you can't say in general that big is more governable or less governable, but you can try to focus on the cross-sectional variation. You could try to focus on areas, circumstances, types of misbehavior where bigness and market power kind of renders all the social institutions somewhat less effective, and then we can discuss what to do about it.
All right. Thank you, Roy. So Luigi, indeed, Jesse set himself to excite me, and therefore he ended his remarks just trying to get my attention that actually bigness and big business is good for democracy. So do you agree?
I think that what he's saying is very dangerous because I think that business, in my view, is adopting the popular thing in the certain elite to cover itself up and continue doing what they care, which is to make money at the cost of violating antitrust, polluting, all those things. So this is kind of the icing on the cake. It's a propaganda, and honestly, I have a very negative view of the entire sort of debate in the United States because the reason why the Republican Party and the Democratic Party needs to be so divided on civil rights issue is because they are so similar on everything else. They're both in the pockets of large business. But, you know, you cannot do a political campaign if you're identical. You need to differentiate yourself. So you end up differentiating on what is most far apart from business, which is the cultural barrier. Because honestly, what is taught in school is not interesting to business. What if they don't say gay bill, etc., is completely sort of tangential. What they do care are the subsidies that they receive. And actually, the amazing thing is that, and I don't subscribe to what DeSantis did in Florida, but the amazing thing is, thanks to what DeSantis did, we learned that basically in Florida, Disney is more powerful than the government. It's just nobody knew that they had the right to appoint a county commissioner, decides what is the law in the county. This is like almost like the East India Company in India, is they have a power of state that is unprecedented. And all this granted on the spirit that they're the good guys. So I think is very, very dangerous, and we need to fight it. And I think that Jesse has the direction of causality wrong. I think that the people are becoming populist, not because they're stupid and don't know how to vote, is because they don't see any alternative to change the system. It says the reason why people voted for Trump, I don't think is because they are racist. They voted for Trump because Trump was hated by the elite and they hate the elite. And so they want to destroy the elite, and they pick the place. And one of the things that we did at the Stigler Center at the beginning was a joint conference with the Harvard Law School about populist plutocrats, a lesson from abroad. So we didn't talk about Trump, but we talked about all the other populist plutocrats and how did they got in power, and what did they do when they were in power. And then you see remarkable similarities everywhere. First you see a failure of the elite. Sometimes the failure means inflation, sometimes a global financial crisis, sometimes it's terrorism, but there's always a failure of the elite. And there is somebody that runs against the elite, and with all the media that dump on him, and the more they dump on him, the more he gets votes. In the first plutocrats in the Philippines, was Estrada, was actually a soap opera actor. and was an idiot, and everybody dumped on him, and the more they were dumping on him, the more people were voting for him. Why? Because they're stupid in Jesse's language? No, it's because they wanted a change. And if you don't have any form of change, you're going to get dangerous change. And let me sort of say something very scary, that I've actually spent some time trying to understand the role played by the so-called cartel in the rise of Hitler to power. And there is an old literature, mostly Marxist, that say that big business financed Hitler, and Hitler got to power because of that. That's not true. And it's just, there was a little bit of financing, but by and large, big business initially were looking down to Hitler as a buffoon. So there wasn't this big thing. What really made it possible for him, what really big business did, is to consolidate power extremely fast. So what we don't really understand today is he got chancellor, in January 1933? By the end of 1933, he had all the power consolidated. So, and Weimar was not like a flourishing democracy, but was not Zimbabwe, okay? And how can you, and there was a very strong social democratic party. This state of Prussia was, until very recently, before Hitler was run by a social democrat. So, and you have a strong union. How can you, in less than a year, go from a democracy to the worst dictatorship in the face of Earth? And that's where the big business play, the catalyzed business play a big role. And why? Because again, it's much easier to buy one person than to buy 200 people. And so if you have just one or two big captains of the industry, as long as you pay them on the side enough, they're going to go along. And they're going to make it difficult for you to fight back. And I think that even if sometimes sort of big business might be in the right direction, again, it's a loaded gun. And if one time the loaded gun protects you, most of the time is aimed at you.
Thank you, Luigi.
So I realized what Jesse said was a provocation, but I can't help it.
Thank you, Jesse.
I really can't help it. So you essentially put forward a dystopian view in which the Brandeisians have got their way, power is being crushed and dispersed, and then we got right-wing populist governments, and it's hell. And we should have business actually saving us. Because they're only ones who are smart and can show us the way. I mean, look, I'm in the company of very wise academics. I'm in the room. I do the cases at the coalface. Let me just put a different perspective, which is what the Brandeisians have reacted to and where that movement came out is nothing like what I think Jesse presents. We are nowhere near there. We're not on the way to get there. It will not happen in generations. The issue is that it was a reaction to an observation, which was the status quo is not great. The status quo has been the serial concentration of markets, one after the other, with effects on performance. One memory, you wanted me to come up with episodes. I remember being in the room at the Metropolitan Club in DC. I don't know if you were there, Bill, but all of this sort of...
I wasn't old enough to get in. The median age is 85.
Yes. 26, no, I was kind of half there. But 2016, Jevons Institute, one of these kind of great and good roundtable. There were 4 FTC commissioners in the room. There was DOJ. There were all of the kind of great and good academics. And Orszag and Furman came and gave the early insight into the work they'd done at the White House under President Obama, showing initial signs that margins were going up and concentration was going up. I was in that room. There was consternation from the Associated Antitrust Club, because all of the academics in the room were like, this is not properly measure concentration. This is not relevant markets, right? These are not relevant antitrust markets. So, and they were like, what? Yeah, but this is not relevant antitrust market, so this measure of concentration tells us nothing, the margins tell us nothing. The commissioners of the FTC, the DOJ representatives, who shall not be named, dismissed it completely. They said, this is nonsense, it's nothing to do with antitrust, you're just not antitrust specialist. You're not in our church, right? You're not in our church, you don't know what you're talking about. Over time, we're seeing people, serious people like Eckhout, De Locker, many others who have actually substantiated. The increasing margins goes with the increasing concentration, the loss of dynamism. We have seen the serial concentration of markets from agrochem to chemicals. And I'm not just talking digital, to pharmaceuticals. Every single one of these markets, in Europe for certain, chemicals, 9 to 8 to 7 to 6 to 3 to 2, telecoms. So what we observe is that this happens, and the antitrust defense bar and the economists who work for the antitrust bar, and I know this world from inside, go and say, nothing there, nothing to see. Nothing there, nothing to see, because, you know, we look at agrochem, well, you're looking at pesticides for aubergines, okay? So there's no overlap over there, wave it through, okay? So this is the reality. This was a relevant market. We had to calculate market share in 35 countries in pesticides for aubergines. And so, because there was no overlap, it was fine. And so this is true. Good work, wasn't it? And so that is really the reality there, which is there is a power structure of very large companies which have been able, by capturing, of course, the defense bar and the economists who made money in this process, to essentially get through the antitrust sausage-making machine intact, right? And so that's what we observe now. So the Brandeisians are saying, but wait a minute, was that the point? Was that the point of antitrust, that we are kind of seeing these markets now with 3, with 2, with 4, and markets are not performing? Shouldn't we go back to some sort of different way of seeing this? Because this consumer welfare, prices always need to be lower, doesn't seem to deliver. So I think that that is really what drives this. And that's where antitrust really needs to just kind of have a complete rethink. And in that sense, I don't think, you know, we should look at the Brandeisian movement as this kind of catastrophic potential outcome. It is just a correction going the other way. I mean, the dial is moved so far up there that we need to just swing it back somewhat. And that's what we need to absolutely pursue.
Okay, I want to move to digital monopolies, but I have to give Jesse an opportunity to respond.
You know, I really should say nothing, because I completely succeeded in my mission, which was to,
Take the rest of the day
which
off.
yeah, I can take the rest of the day off, drink coffee. Just two quick things. Obviously, I don't have anything bad to say about antitrust per se, trying to ensure that consumer surplus is maximized, and I'm sure it has gone too far in the wrong direction, so I'm happy to see a movement back towards the center. I'm just worried about the ultimate objective of people like Elizabeth Warren, who are interested in basically crushing big businesses and remaking our economy. I think there's a potential downside to doing that in terms of political outcomes. In Israel, which I'm a little bit more familiar with because we now have this right-wing populist government, we don't have one in the United States now, I don't think the people that elected Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Netanyahu and the Haredi parties elected them because there was insufficient enforcement of antitrust laws in Israel. These, you know, the groups that elected these people have their own ideological agendas that they're trying to push. And that's what drove them. And I do think it's true that business in Israel played an important role in pushing back and leading, in my view, to a much better outcome. What will happen in the future in the United States or other countries, I don't know. But I think in this instance, business did play a successful role. And so I'll end there since we have limited time.
May I?
Yes, Bill, please.
One thought about fragmented industries, and this is just a caution about whether or not fragmented industries get you the political balance that you want. I think it's a mistake to assume that fragmented industries are powerless in the political process. And I look at all of the service industries in the United States over the past century that have organized very effectively, not just at the national level, but at the state level. They're called doctors, they're lawyers, they're accountants, they're taxi drivers, they're beauticians, they're the people who do your nails, they're the people who operate car washes, all of whom have been very successful in getting licensure requirements that impose fairly substantial barriers to entry. They also are very good at providing the packets of campaign finance assistance on which politicians thrive in the US system. So I'd be a little bit cautious about assuming that if you fragment industries, that they won't be able to organize effectively in order to get legislation that they want that also suppresses competition. And the other caution is about looking at the populist mood. American voters are hypocrites at a very fundamental level. And just think of climate change. What do Americans want? They want energy that is abundant, reliable, green, cheap, safe, across the board. The last thing they want is to face the real price of using carbon. And that's what Americans want. So when the popular mood swings in a certain direction, I don't know that I trust it, especially on issues that really count.
Before we continue, Ido, how much time do we have? 20 minutes. 20 minutes, fine. Okay, so we can, by the way, Jesse, antitrust and politics, that Netanyahu is indicted at least in 2 cases for trying to, stop competition in the market. So there is some kind of connection of what's happening today in politics with antitrust. By the way, Bill, yeah, please.
The less power the government has, the less able politicians are to extract bribes from business. So the more power you give government, the greater their ability to get bribes.
But here, of course, you assume that government, that the antitrust authority is just an arm of the government used to go after political opponents.
Unfortunately, things like that happen.
Okay. All right. Okay, so let's bring to the fold here perhaps the digital monopolies, okay, and their role in, democracies or destabilizing democracy. Ariel, what's your take on it?
So we have 2 illusions here. The first is the illusion of the market. So when we speak about digital, just to start us, the problem that we have is that we completely shifted to a different reality. We have algorithms, we have big data, we have the ability to micro-target each and every one of you. So the reality, the market in which we operate is a market where most of you are transparent. Most of you are maybe walking with a sense of autonomy, and you have a sense that you know what you're doing and you're making a choice, but everything is very easily determined for you. So I can create friction between you and something that you want to buy and remove friction, so basically to lead you with your sense of autonomy somewhere. So when we speak about digital markets, we speak about gatekeepers, platforms, there is a whole discussion on competition on those markets, and that level of competition or that dynamic of competition is very different from what you know from the high street. Because in the high street, you're anonymous to a certain level. The market price is a market price. Online, we have many times discriminatory pricing, personal pricing. So this is a whole debate which is the background to our debate on democracy. Because in that market reality, what also happens is that once you allow certain companies to gain power and they basically operate the market. They also operate the market for ideas. So what is true for pricing? What is true to you going and trying to book an airline and getting the airline that I want to push because I changed the order of the search, or I changed the apps that work well on your phone or not? All of that also relevant to the market for ideas. And this is where it becomes really scary, because you realize that our failures at the competition level also have significant failures that impact on it. You're all familiar with Cambridge Analytica, I assume, which is a very known story, which is just one symptom of the reality. We now know that a politician in the old world had to give a speech that somehow satisfies all of you. This is prehistoric strategy. What we know now is that I can micro-target you. If some of you are interested in violence, I will give a speech against violence. And if some of you are in favor of an aggressive stance against something, I will give you, and I can micro-target. And we know, for example, Brexit in the UK, we know that on Facebook, some people got messages that spoke about Turkish people going to immigrate into the UK, and some people got messages about the NHS, and there is absolutely no record, because this is not the free press, so you cannot go to the archive and see what on earth was happening. And we also know that all of it was lies. So there has always been in history the art of misleading us, the people. There's nothing new here. Propaganda was not invented with the internet. Okay? So all the ideas behind it were always in place. You have Plato's noble lies. You have the whole idea of selling illusions to the people. But now it's on steroids. What changed is the ability now to create a hyper reality that is so different, and yet each and every one of us lives in our little eco bubble and basically feels that we're doing the right thing. And once you have that, what you have, I don't know how many of you are familiar with simulacra. The concept is a philosophical concept, which instead of the media reflecting reality, instead of the news reflecting the reality, instead of a map reflecting whatever is the terrain, what we now face is that the map determines the terrain. So it doesn't matter if you had a whistleblower, because if I know that there is bad news and I can flood the airways with a lot of stories and noise, I will divert the attention. And it doesn't matter if someone has something that is really important about corruption, because if I control it and I control the airways, I can determine where it goes. I'll give you an example from Facebook that I find really interesting. Facebook discovered that when you go to vote, and if you then say, I voted, then your friends will be incentivized to go and vote. So we all react to our friends saying, hey, I've done something positive, which is great. So the I voted button, when I put it on, it will encourage our other people. Now just think, if Facebook is controlled by someone with a political agenda, and that person knows your political affiliation, I can determine who are the people that when they put the I voted button, who are those people that will know about it, and who will not. I can activate certain parts of society and put to sleep other parts of society. And I can do it maybe thinking that I'm doing the right thing. But democracy, the way we know it, is long gone. The democracy where you think that you have a market for idea and we together come to reach a certain outcome, this is a story of the past. And that story sits in a story of a problem with competition. And this is the link. This is where in digital you see it at such intensity that it's almost impossible to ignore the crisis that we face.
All right, thank you, Ariel. Cristina, you wanna add to that?
Yeah, I want to inject a sense of urgency into this because I think I agree with much of what you say, Ariel. You say some of this propaganda has been around forever. I always kind of bristle when I hear these kind of things on a panel. I was on a panel on AI, somebody said, AI has been around for 40 years, and their opening statement, I was thinking, darling, don't say that, because then everybody thinks, oh, then it's boring, I don't need to worry about it anymore. No, it's not that it's been around.
If there is a misunderstanding, do worry.
Yes, it's not, I mean, the fact that it's, the issue, the concern has been around, as you said, it's on steroid. I mean, I think where digital is a whole different world in which the failures of antitrust are grotesque, frankly. They are extraordinary. And the bad news is that I don't know what the answer is, and I don't think anyone really does. So in digital, when the digital exploded in our lives, we were kind of thinking of some sort of nirvana in which we were going to sort of switch and flick between different sites. The reality, as we know, in the last 10 years is that we funneled down to monopolies in search, monopolies in e-commerce, monopoly in social network, monopoly or quasi-monopoly everywhere. So to give the story of what has happened in Europe, Europe was at the forefront in some sense, although a bit late, in the effort to try and tackle all of this. The European Commission started in 2010, the first case against Google on shopping, when the US was in permafrost. Nothing was happening in this space. So 2010, the Commission started Google Shopping, then in 2014 started Google Android, then Google AdSense. These cases took 7 years to be concluded, and they concluded in a big fat 0. In part because the time it took to get there, grotesquely gamed by the parties, by the companies to delay, because the remedies are totally inept and ineffective. We don't know what to tell them to do. Don't do it again. Okay, I'll do it again. Don't do it again. Okay. You know, this is true not just of Google. Facebook, we haven't even begun to tackle. Apple's cases have been going for 5 years. There's no resolution. Amazon cases have been going. So antitrust, frankly, in Europe has not delivered a bean. So that's why we pivoted to this ex-ante regulation, which I don't want to discuss in depth, but this has been our sort of way to say, oops, didn't work, let's try something else. We do ex-ante. So we have this thing, which is the DMA, and don't get me wrong, it is a great democratic project in which the European Parliament has rushed through law very, very speedily, and everybody agreed much more than has happened in the United States. The implementation of this thing is going to be incredibly difficult, and in my view, is not going to lead very far, because these companies are just too big, too powerful, too effective, and the entire game is going to be circumvent, delay, circumvent, delay. So this is really the conundrum we find ourselves in. And it is one in which I don't know how antitrust can recover much of the ground that has been lost. Regulation, to my mind, isn't going to get there. We're going to do some tickling of these companies at the margin. We tickle their sides. But that's where we are.
Okay, so I want to dig deeper here with the help of Roy and Luigi from different directions, perhaps. So, Roy, one of the problems that we have here in the audience today, I suspect that we don't have enough Netanyahu supporters here. So I want to voice. I want to, you know, if we had more Netanyahu supporters here, the answer would be, you know, social networks are amazing. They saved us from the liberal media that controls everything since, you know, we started this country. And, you know, we have, for the first time, free flow of information. Do you agree?
So let me just answer it by taking, you know, like Luigi's keynote lecture here. If you really need to kind of change corporate behavior, you need reputational discipline to work. The fact that, and this goes to the questions from the audiences, the fact that someone tweeted something or put something on social media doesn't mean that there will be reputational discipline, right? It would be like a tree falling in the forest when no one is there. Did it really make a sound, right? So for reputational discipline to really work, it would have to be not just revealed, but also widely diffused, usually by the media, would have to be certified as credible, right? Would have to be attributed by the target audience to something bad, indicative of how the company will behave in the future. They will be willing to act on it, and so on and so forth. And so, to me, this notion that, again, speaking only about the corporate misbehavior aspect rather than general democratic process, but the notion that social media could really change corporate behavior, it could change things such as, you go to McDonald's, you purchase nuggets, and there's something bad in the nugget, somebody posting it online, it becomes viral. It can't really change things that are less salient and more complex. And I think it also dovetails with the Jesse debate, right? And I think you can reconcile it with the facts, with the studies on corporate misbehavior. So it's saliency and complexity. In issues of high saliency and low complexity, big business will actually behave better. They will utilize their resources. They will be at the forefront. At the same time that DuPont was emitting this extremely toxic chemical, it was at the forefront of fighting against, the ozone layer and nuclear energy and everything. Or to use one of Jesse's favorite topics from today, board diversity. The biggest companies are better at checking the box on some corporate governance issues and having more board diversity. But on the less salient and more complex topic, they utilize their market power to kind of operate in liminal zones or operating in gray areas.
Luigi. So Elon Musk, Luigi is a hero of many people around the world, including here in Israel. We see that for some reason in the last 2 years, Elon has become like a hero of people who support Netanyahu, because he's like the beacon of free speech, and he's an entrepreneur and a successful business people. And I remember, Luigi, that you were very suspicious of the Zuckerbergs of the world many years ago, before Cambridge Analytica and so on.
So what do you want to know? My opinion about Elon Musk? Actually, I don't consider him a hero at all. I never had a Elon Musk infatuation. I find it actually good that we have somebody with a slightly different view controlling one social media, because I think that from the competition between different views, we might get a better result. In the sense, in the world in which the people were running Facebook, the people were running Google, and the people were running Twitter were identical in terms of political views, ethnicity, everything else. You had less chances of some alternative to emerge. And honestly, I've been asking myself for a long time why Elon Musk bought Twitter. And I came to the conclusion that he bought just to be free. Because he understood that after he saw that Trump was removed from Twitter, he said, now I am a world figure with 100 million followers, but at the end of the day, I depend upon 3 employees at Twitter. Because 3 employees at Twitter can make me basically worthless instantaneously. Because a lot of his cachet is about 100 million followers and what he can do and what he can. And it says, I don't think Tesla would be like where it is if he didn't have that channel. So I think that for him was a question of life and death. And he bought it in spite of all the money it cost him, because I think it was worth it. But this is a very sad world, and I am with Ariel on this. It's a very sad world in which you only have to spend $40 billion to be free. I wish a world in which we could all be free. And now, how to go to that world is a much more difficult question. But I think that the direction that Ariel is going is the right one. We need to have more overseeing of the mechanism of selection and promotion. And I think that the decentralization of the editing and pushing is a way to go, but I'm not so sure is the perfect solution. But I don't see a lot of other solutions around.
All right. We have only 5 minutes. 5 minutes to go, so I want to take a few questions from the from the audience. Yes, please. Do we have a mic, by the way, for the audience? No. Okay.
How do we rebrand Antitrust as something
It's positive and not negative. Rebranding of Antitrust, Ariel, that's your thing.
How do we brand it? I think the problem is not the branding. The problem is with the discipline that was misused or not used to its full potential. The branding is good, and even in Israel, it's no longer antitrust. It's competition. It's pro-competition. I think people understand the value of competition. Everyone understands that we benefit from competition. The problem is how we get there, and the problem is that along the way, we have a few very powerful players that hijacked the discipline. So I think it's a good branding, but poor execution.
Yes, please go ahead.
It's sort of connected to the question of aiding and abetting to the private sector. And in the private markets, there's institutional investors who hold shares in public companies. There's this, and they're holding them on behalf of the general public, the unsophisticated investors and so on. There's a lot of power to the idea of M&A, emerging economic modes and everything. Even if there's a lot of research that suggests that a lot of mergers are destructive. They're not very productive. They're very good for actors and consultants and so on. So what role do they need to play in this area? Because it may be that even on the economic basis, the kind of traditional financial economic arguments, they're not meeting their own standards, never mind then all the social issues that come out of it.
Who would like to address that? This is a question again about the people aiding and abetting. Bill?
There would have been a way to get a much better understanding about what's actually happening in the M&A market, and that would have been to invest over a period of decades in an after-effect assessment of how mergers actually turn out. You could have had a very simple process of identifying expected returns and measuring them against actual outcomes. And that could have been a program that was funded through competition agencies. It could have been funded with the Association of Academic Hubs. But it comes back in a part to the question that was posed before, which is why the disappointment rebranding? Well, you have to invest in this if you want it to work. You have to invest in gathering the knowledge. You have to make a substantial outlay in the research and development budget that allows you to follow this, to build an empirical foundation for making judgments more precisely about what works and what doesn't. And this comes back to the hypocrisy of a democracy. We want to drive a Mercedes, but we want to pay for a Chevy. And we can't imagine why the Chevy doesn't operate like the Mercedes. So if you want to do these things, you can. But Cristina, in a way, touched upon a fundamental problem that the new transformation movement has posed, is that it's got ambitions to go to Mars, but I'm not sure that it can even get to Kansas City. That is, we don't want to pay for that. We don't want to do that kind of work. And I'm afraid in this instance, you can't do this on the cheap. But there was a way to do that. There's still a way to do that. But that's seen as dull and boring. That is, who wants to do that kind of work? So there's a way to do this. And there's been some nice work done at times to try and measure this. But it requires a commitment to take account of a variety of institutional factors and to build the institutions up to do the job now. I mean, the dismal view of the whole by the way, this debate's gone on for a long time. That is, you'll find a hard time in the US experience to find a period where people said, at the time, this is really going well. This really works. It is a literature of lamentation. And the most dismal view of it was Thurman Arnold's before he became the head of the Antitrust Division. He writes a book called The Folklore of Capitalism, and he said, antitrust is a charade that gives the public the comfort of thinking there's control, but in fact there isn't. He likened them to laws against prostitution. He said, laws against prostitution give society the moral virtue of saying, stop that. But at night, things go on the way they did all the time. He was asked about this at his confirmation hearings and asked basically, why do you want to be the head of a bordello? He said, I was an academic. I write all kinds of stuff like that. But I think the gloomy view of the field that has to be overcome in asking questions about how we do this is, do we want it to be a real effective system, or do we want it to be a charade?
Okay, Didi, please, quickly. Yeah. Cristina, that's your.
Well, that's my own specialist subject. So, well, you're right. I mean, you know, in antitrust practice, if you want to just get out from under the problem, you either define the market very narrowly or very wide. Okay? Either then. Very wide, you have small market share. Very narrow, you don't overlap. This is the kind of tried and tested. What you're alluding to is how do we deal with the fact that there are companies, multi-market companies with conglomerate presence in multiple parts of the value chain. And this is absolutely a key question right now, because the notion of an ecosystem, for example, which is related to what you say, companies own assets, they have capabilities in different places. And it is the collection of these assets and capabilities that make them what they are. The question is, how do we assess that in an antitrust context? It is an incredibly topical question. I have an article coming out on it this week, because fundamentally, if you kind of use the traditional approach, you kind of don't go anywhere. Because the answer is, well, is there a relevant market in which there is either an overlap or a vertical relationship? If there isn't, well, you know, the fact that you have assets over here, assets over there, says nothing about this particular merger. So really, this is an area which is super important, because unless we tackle this, and unless we are able to effectively be able to bring this combination of assets into the assessment, the current way we practice, the current way we do it in front of the agencies doesn't allow us to do this. And so it's a problem. I don't have an answer, but it's a problem.
Quick question here.
Very quickly.
Last one, yeah.
2 weeks ago, you know, the OpenAI CEO, Saltman, OpenAI.
Sam Altman.
And just in front of the conference hearing, talking about the risk of AI, and he was invited to be the task force, you know, to supervise, to regulate AI. So I want maybe Professor Ezrachi.
Ezrachi.
Is your name Israel Ezrachi? Really?
No one knows.
The digital business, because it's about monopoly of algorithm. So how would that affect the knowledge structure of the future regulators?
It's a massive question. Let me think how best to so you have the interface between business and government, and obviously all of that. I think the interesting thing, if I'll take one area from that, is that when you look at those large companies that now determines what it is, we tend to think of them as innovators, as if what they bring us is really great innovation and this. But what you have to remember is that those who actually are the first to go through the door, once they dominate a junction, what they also do is they cast a shadow on all the paths of innovation that are likely to follow. And what we see is that all the biggest platforms are distorting the paths of innovation, and the incentives that they have that are derived from the legislation that we have and the reward systems that we have actually determine our future. So it's a partial answer, but what I want to highlight is that one of the key problems that we have is that once we crown a company or a business as the ones who are going to explain to us what to do, this has a massive impact not only on our understanding, but actually it also determines who are the winners of the future, and that's an immense problem.
But I think, sorry, just to conclude on this, I'm super worried about what's happening right now, this week, next week, last week, in this debate on AI. Because what you've seen is Sam Altman's rock star whistle-stop tour of Europe saying, It's super intelligent technology. It's great. It's innovative. But yeah, it could be bad. But we don't know what to do. Tell us what to do, regulators. Regulators tell us what to do, and then you have the letter from the geniuses who have actually been supporting AI and making AI for the last 20 years, saying the robots will eat us, will kill us. This letter came out 2 days ago. Like, where were you in the last 5 years? What have you been doing? Now you're telling me the robot will kill me? I mean, this is a joke. And the point is that everyone is going, oh my God, we need an AI Act. Oh, we need an AI Act in 2025 to come into place in 2026. Let's all meet in Luleå, Sweden, and talk about doing a voluntary pact. Is anyone on drugs? I mean, honestly, is anyone on drugs? Because this is just so out of what needs to happen. And I mean, where are antitrust regulators? Lina Khan said something, everyone else is sitting there saying, I'm watching this. I mean, this is really happening under our noses. We will lose this battle like we lost the internet, like we lost social networks. Good luck to us.
How many competition agencies in the world do you think have the slightest idea of what AI is?
Yes, but
And if you gave them a half sheet of paper and said, give me a definition of what's going
No,
on.
they think it's
how many-
I/O, not AI.
How many have a tech capability inside? I love the far-sighted vision of the FTC chair, but her agency does not have the capacity to really deal with those issues right now. And when you go to writing legislation, where do you think the expertise to write legislation on this topic is going to come from? From committee staffs? From parliamentary committees? The industry will write the bill.
I don't think it's, I mean, Bill, you have people like Meredith Whittaker and now at Signal, you have people inside the FTC who are real knowledgeable about this. You have Sarah Myers-West. I think we're not totally hapless. I agree with you. Inside the agencies, I mean, the expertise isn't necessarily there, but I mean, the answer cannot be let's sit for 2 years and wait for them to tell us.
It means you've got to invest in getting the right people. You cannot win a Formula One race by riding an ostrich, and that's what the agencies are doing now.
Okay, on this happy note, thank you very much.
Fantastic.